Carrie, you gonna get everybody in here? Carrie, you gonna get everybody in here? AJ, you can make an announcement up there. Just say it out loud. Yeah. Out there. Yeah.
How you doing? Seth Kirshenberg. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Seth. All right. Oh, there we go. All right. Hopefully everyone had a good break. And I think we're going to get started real quickly. I'm excited because we've got Christine on another panel here. Our first speaker, everyone knows Christine King, so I'm going to skip that intro real quickly and just introduce the rest of the panel. We're going to be talking about understanding industrial applications in nuclear energy, which means that there's a lot of opportunities for nuclear energy. I think that's a great way of putting it. So sitting next to me here is Ali Zbib, his nuclear industry program manager at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, PNNL. Those of you who are going on the tour, we're going to get to visit the site on Friday. We're very excited about that. Ben, who's second from the end, Reinke, he's the Vice President of Global Business Development at X Energy. We're real excited about their project down in Texas. And then our good friend, our partner in a lot of different projects, Laura Hermann, who's the Executive Officer of
Potentiary.
Thank you, Laura. Christine, let me hand it over to you.
Okay, so I want you to imagine me taller. I think it's about 4 inches. Shannon's 6 foot tall and she has long blonde hair. And she apologizes for not being able to be here. Shannon Bragg-Sitton caught a pretty bad cold. So I'm going to do my best. While I have heard her do this presentation a lot, I haven't done it. So be kind, that's what I would say. So going into this next sector, we've talked a lot about nuclear power. This is really about nuclear energy, and this is really going to be about the thermal energy and what you might be able to do with it. Many of you probably, if you've been attending these types of meetings, you've heard, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I want us to hear from others on the panel, but the energy system that we are going to have at the end of the next 3 or 4 decades is going to look very different than what we have today. And there is an opportunity here to build and consider industrial parks, doing things close to load, behind the meter, with different types of fuel sources. So with that, nuclear energy can be the anchor point for successful decarbonization in many different ways. But the cool thing here is, just like you want your retirement portfolio to be diversified, nuclear can help you diversify your energy portfolio through integrated systems. Having the confidence of firm power gives you the ability to take renewables as long as they're available and make sense. And so you can see along the bottom here all the different resources where nuclear energy can be your anchor point. So if you're considering a nuclear reactor, this discussion is really, so now that I have nuclear power, what else can I do with it? Hydrogen is one of those things. And this is where you start to see the broad impact of the Department of Energy. A lot of folks don't understand hydrogen is not an energy generating source. It is a great energy carrier. It has to be produced. One of the most efficient ways to produce it is with high temperature electrolysis. and currently a lot of it is produced through steam methane reforming with coal plants or natural gas plants, okay? So if we want to produce hydrogen cleanly in the future, the advanced reactors is an excellent pathway. What does that unlock for us? By having hydrogen, it helps us to decarbonize not only grid scale energy, but different transportation fuels, fertilizers, the production of chemicals. Ben might know something about that. And moving into also looking at the thermal energy that nuclear energy produces in terms of things like district heating or oil production. So decarbonizing electricity is actually the easy part. Decarbonizing industrials and chemicals is going to be the harder part. There are 3 pilot plant hydrogen demonstration projects that are underway. You see them listed here. Constellation just started producing hydrogen last year. We are expecting the Energy Harbor Davis-Besse plant to produce this year, as well as the Prairie Island plant. So these are existing nuclear assets that are producing hydrogen as a way to have another source of revenue for the company. So I'm going to turn it back. I think that's it. Oh, and the clean hydrogen hubs. I don't remember when the DOE put out these big fancy announcements. It seems like just yesterday. Kara and I are laughing. As you start to look at, so I said, focusing on where, right? Understanding where these types of things are going to happen and how that impacts the region. When you start to think about hydrogen, one of the things that's also being explored is how do you transport it? How do you store it? So will we be able to use the natural gas infrastructure associated in these regions eventually to transport hydrogen? Now I'm done. So with that, let's talk about Shannon is always detailed. If you want to read more about it, if you don't want to read all that, and you just want to talk to somebody, I'd be glad to give you Shannon's phone number.
Thanks, Christine.
You're not on.
I'm not on.
There we go.
I am on.
There you go.
You're on now.
So helpful presentation. The pilots we see are basically industrial applications at existing nuclear sites. Thinking about new nuclear and co-locating industrial facilities and new nuclear together, that's really exciting. And it's not just for hydrogen. There, obviously, you said there's many different applications. But how should the community think about this new form of co-location? What's important to think about? What are some synergies? What are the key questions that should be asked when considering this type of collaborative approach? And let's start with Laura.
Okay. So if the question is what do communities need to know,
Yes,
right? It's
yes.
really, I think there are there's a push signal and a pull signal that I think needs to happen in the industry. So I think Christine did a good job distinguishing the application of nuclear power for electricity production versus the process heat applications. And so in addition to generating electricity, we can also use that process heat to do other processes, whether it's chemical processing or production of hydrogen or other types of industrial uses. And I think that's gotten the attention of a much broader array of people to consider nuclear, because generally, if you're just going to use nuclear to produce electricity, as we heard in the last panel, you have to have the utilities at the table. But when you start talking about process heat applications for nuclear power uses, now you've introduced a range of new people who can consider using nuclear. So part of what I have been working on in the last 5 or 6 years, I'll do this by way of a story because I think it's more interesting. In 2015, I was working, TerraPower was my largest client at the time, and I was very involved with the Paris Agreement and the launch of Mission Innovation in 2015. That was at one of the big COP climate negotiations. And at the time, it was the first time that nuclear had made an appearance in one of these big global forums. And in subsequent years, during those climate negotiations, the nuclear advocates in the room here and throughout the industry really worked hard to continue to push nuclear into the decarbonization agenda. And so we saw that in the subsequent COPs. Last year at the Committee of Parties negotiation in the UAE, they announced the tripling of nuclear. So this is a huge sea change. And it was done largely without the nuclear community being present at those COPs. I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos last year, and in previous years, the nuclear companies are not there talking about the need for nuclear. It is mining executives. It is the executives at Blackstone. It is the executives in the aviation industry. Other industries that realize, particularly in Europe, that where they face a carbon tax, they need better sources of carbon-free energy. And so that's really where I think this conversation is going right now. And so communities are participating in a conversation that dates back, probably 10 years. And I think that there's a lot of supporting material that you can look at to really understand not only how to attract the companies to your community, but also how you can support nuclear. What is happening in your community that already relates to some of the industrial interest that's emerging in nuclear now?
It's really helpful. Ellie, what's your perspective?
So I'll add to that perspective and state that there's tremendous value in communicating the benefits and the value of co-locating a clean energy resource like nuclear power with industrial applications. And I think that discussion with the community, with the host community, should start early. But there's also value in, as you do that, in being open about maybe what I would call the added complexity of now bringing in a nuclear power plant and co-locating it in the vicinity of a chemical production facility. And there's value in helping the community understand that, but there's also value in to the developer and the company in sharing that information. Because what that will show is that we belong, for those of us that have worked in this industry for so long, belong to an industry that has historically had an excellent safety record and is very, very rigorous about assessing the risks of any changes to how we operate nuclear power plants. And if we start thinking about the added complexity of co-location and share that with the community, we'll quickly share the reality that with co-location there are hazards, additional hazards that you need to assess, chemical releases and how that impacts the potential operation of a nuclear power plant or the control room that operates that nuclear power plant. And what the community will quickly learn is this is an industry that really takes these hazards and these assessments very, very seriously, and they're integral of the process of licensing and siting that nuclear power plant. And so there's a lot of expertise in the industry, in the national labs that have looked at this, and they'll help assess how far does that nuclear power plant need to be from these hazards. So basically site optimization and so on. And there's already a lot of work going on in this area. And so transparency about the tremendous benefits of co-location as well as how we address any perceived risk is very critical.
Christine, you've been to at least 1 million different places in the U.S., and you've probably engaged in these types of conversations in half those places. What are the key questions, or what are the ideas that are coming out of these?
So I kind of don't think it starts with nuclear.
Mm-hmm. That's a common theme of yours.
Yeah.
Not starting with nuclear, yeah.
I think what I hear, for example, if you have states that don't have decarbonization goals, right? Where this plays in is where manufacturing is part of their heritage. It's where their workforce and their economy is based on it. And they have, corporations have clean energy goals. So they're getting questions of how are you going to give me clean energy such that I don't pull out my facility and go to a state that will give me clean energy. So when you talk to communities, right, it's do you have that understanding of how that fits into their tax basis and who they are and who they want to continue to be. From an industrial perspective, I also think, especially with some of the rural communities that I've been to, you should ask how big do they want to be. Some folks live in rural communities because they want to live in a small community. So co-location might actually be too much, right? But it does open up the opportunity for, if you think about, so one of the more radical ones that so how many people have heard that data centers want nuclear power plants? Okay, everybody should be raising your hand, right? Okay, it's the bright, shiny object out there. Data centers don't bring jobs, right? And they want their energy today, right? So if we look at the retirement of fossil fuels and co-locating there, we give jobs, we repurpose a workforce, and there's a panel on this tomorrow about repurposing sites, and you could have a data center there. The waste heat off of a data center, you could do district heating, you could do big greenhouses, right? Things that might fit into a rural community. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Ben because I think Texas and all of the chemical companies they have there, right, have a different need. And I think that's where the demonstration project at X Energy makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, thanks. If you'll allow me, I'll take 2 minutes to quickly describe what we're doing, why we think it's exciting, and then dive into this community question. So at X Energy, we have a type of reactor that operates at higher temperatures. I'll in the pitch session in about 45 minutes, I'll give you the full story on that. But the reason that we're excited about this technology is really it's a fitting together of an extremely high safety case alongside the ability to operate at higher temperatures and use that heat for industrial purposes, processes. So, today, all the modern building blocks that we live on are really resources that are extracted from the ground and then turned into higher value products, and every stage of that process requires electricity, heat, or both. Most of the time it takes both. And that is a market that today is served by almost exclusively fossil fuels. Historically it was coal. Then we saw with the advent of gas that became an even better technology often. So when you look across the scheme, all of the things that we use are either provided for by the grid, electricity, or most often, if it's a very large manufacturing facility, it's actually behind the meter production that the owner of that manufacturing facility owns or an independent power producer owns, co-located together. So we at X Energy are working on this technology called a high temperature gas reactor, and for many decades this has been kind of the bright shining star concept of the advanced reactor community for what could allow us to open up the industrial heat market to nuclear. And it's always been something we've talked about, in academic meetings and in climate meetings, as Laura referenced. And there's been tremendous work done at the national laboratories. I think that both Christine and Ali have identified correctly that there is not just only a large amount of capability, but a lot of work that we're building upon. So take all that together, what does it mean? Well, for the first time, we're actually opening the industrial heat market. So with our project with Dow Chemical, which is under the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, we will actually sell reactors to Dow. They will deploy those as a direct replacement for 3 natural gas boilers that they operate today at a facility that's called the Seadrift Operations Center. Seadrift is about 150 miles south of Houston and will be a direct replacement for those 3 natural gas cogens. Now, why does that really matter? Well, petrochemicals as an industry are similar in many ways to the steel industry, the aluminum industry, and many others. If you don't just use electricity, but you also need heat, you likely produce that at site. Why? Because you can't pipe heat that far, right? You have to be proximate if you're gonna provide heat somewhere. So you take the steam from our reactors and then you directly power the petrochemical system. Now they have their own steam distribution center, but that petrochemical facility requires almost exactly one reactor operating at full power from our facility at all times. That's a tremendous amount of heat, if you think about it that way, right? They also need something like a reactor's worth of electricity. And so when we look at the industrial market, you're really not talking about just providing heat or electricity, you're talking about providing reliable heat or reliable electricity. Because when they're not operating, they're not making money. This is a commoditized world, a very competitive world, and they need to be able to operate. So with our reactors, we'll deploy 4 in total, which is similar to what they do today. They overbuild capacity. They sell electricity from operating facilities today back to the market, and then they take the first call rights on the most valuable thing that they've got, which is reliable steam. So with a generation facility today with 3 boilers, they're able to provide nearly 100% reliable steam and electricity to that site. They're able to export additional electricity when it makes sense with the market conditions, or they could potentially sell to a secondary off-taker. We're basically a drop-in replacement for that with a nuclear facility with 4 reactors. Now, all that said, how does that play in the community? I think Christine said this very, very well, which is when you look at industrial communities, they're often communities that are used to having, big industrial things in their backyard. If you look at a petrochemical facility, they're typically much more hazardous. They're often much more dangerous than a nuclear power plant. Just look at the statistics. And you know that they take safety very, very seriously as well. So there's a common culture and there's a common language that those communities share with nuclear communities. You tend to find a fairly high acceptance of nuclear in heavy industrial communities as well. So for just the quick anecdote, and to kind of, I guess, hammer on the point that Christine made, when we were in Seadrift to announce that we were bringing the reactors to that site, we did a preview meeting with the staff at the Seadrift facility. And Dow getting into the nuclear business, X-Energy announcing its first site, while on pins and needles wondering how the staff at the facility were going to take the idea of dropping a nuclear reactor in their backyard. And to our very, very positive surprise, the announcement was made and there was a standing ovation from everybody in the room. And the reaction was, you have made an investment in our community and in our petrochemical manufacturing facility. Now, the next day we had a meeting with a lot of folks in the community, and I sat at a table with a gentleman and his wife who were both in their 90s. The gentleman who was there, his father sold the land to Dow. Actually, at the time it was a separate company, Union Carbide, that was acquired by Dow, but sold the land from his farm to build that facility. And he wanted to know what was going to be occurring at that site. He wanted to know what was going to happen with the legacy land, but they are truly part of the community, and they lived about 2 miles down the road. And their questions were extremely practical questions. Tell me about my cattle herd. What happens if there's radiation in the water table? Will it affect my cattle herd? But there weren't questions about being scared of nuclear. They just wanted a practical discussion about the risks and the benefits. And overall, at another table, I think the best part of the story was there was a family there with 3 generations that all had worked at that plant. Well, technically 2. There was a set of grandparents, there was a young couple, and they had their son with them who was, I think, 1 or 2 years old, and they had announced to everybody that he was going to work at Seadrift one day when he grew up. And their point was, we're extremely excited. You're making an investment in a 60-year nuclear asset, which means to us there's going to be another 60 years of petrochemicals made that will make our modern lives great here in this community.
Thanks, Ben. What's really interesting, when the announcement was made, I think there was a lot of excitement in the, in the industry and everything. What were some of the, first, who approached whom between X-Energy and Dow? And then, how did it kind of evolve from there? And then, Ali, I also want you to kind of talk about, what are you hearing from, other potential users when you're starting to talk about nuclear as well?
I just want to go on record that Gain gave Dow a voucher before your announcement. We were first.
You did. That's true.
It's Christine again.
So I won't give you all of the details. I'm sure some portion of it's protected under NDA or something. But the short version is we were approached by Dow. I think it's actually a pretty interesting story. Dow's experience with nuclear goes back many decades. They worked with the next generation nuclear plant as an advisory member of that project. And so there's a lot of institutional knowledge of the concept of a high-temperature gas reactor enabling clean petrochemical production. And what happened, roughly speaking, was their CEO asked the existential question, what am I going to do to decarbonize? As we've heard here, I think Laura said it very well as well. You've got pressure from your end users that's coming from their customers. And so, Dow had firm clean energy commitments. How are they going to meet those commitments? And, when Dow talks about this publicly, they usually say, you've got hydrogen as an option, but you have to make it, and you've got to use it, and you have to somehow figure out how that's going to work economically. So you have to have access to a reliable hydrogen supply. And you have carbon capture, which works in certain jurisdictions if you have a place to sequester it. And it works in particular well with certain processes where you're going to generate carbon anyways in that process, but it's not ideal for everything. And so nuclear was the last leg of the stool they potentially had to lean on, and there wasn't an option that they knew of available in the market. And when they spoke with their trade groups told them, absolutely, SMRs will exist. It won't help you on the high temperature side, but they will be around in the market, probably the first ones deployed sometime between 2040 and 2050. That was the message that they got. And luckily, there was somebody at a senior level internally there who knew our CEO from back in the day and thought, I don't think that guy would have gone to a startup nuclear company that wasn't going to deploy something for the next 25 years. So he gave him a call, and it led to an introduction and a discussion early on. But the conversation was driven by the CEO of Dow, who said, I want to see whether or not this is doable. And I think it's indicative of how most of our conversations have gone with heavy industrials. There are two conversations you have to have simultaneously. Number one, is there a technical solution fit that works? And number two, is it possibly economic? And you have to deal with those at the same time, because some companies want to know one before the other, or vice versa, but they need to know timeline, economic fit, and technological fit, because often these heavy industrials are looking at this in terms of a long-term planning that they already do. If they want to own assets like Dow, then they're looking at major capital allocations like they normally look at major capital allocations. I'm going to put billions of dollars into infrastructure in a window, but I need to make sure that my existing plants continue to operate, and they're end of life of assets that happen to cycle off. So we're going to replace assets that are going to come to the end of their life. And that's a really easy economic decision for an actor to make if they believe that the reactors can be deployed on time and on budget. So, there are a lot of pieces to the conversation, but you have to get over those hurdles, and you got to work through it. And with industrials, you have to teach them a little bit of nuclear speak. You got to get them convinced that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission isn't the boogeyman, and you have to learn how to speak industrial as well.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so you asked me what else have we discussed out there, and I'll probably share maybe 3 quick examples. Because as you just said, there's tremendous interest and tremendous pressure by the community, by the states, by government to decarbonize different sectors of our industry or our economy. And so we've had discussions with developers on how we could, as a national lab that does independent studies, how could we help them assess the value proposition of co-location, but also looking at, as I said earlier, site optimization. A nuclear power plant needs to be as close as possible to the production facility to provide that high quality steam with minimal heat losses, but also how far do you need to be to assess, to ensure that you also take all the hazards into consideration. So this is some of the work that PNNL has done. But we've also been approached, as you mentioned earlier, data centers. My colleague of mine recently introduced us to the folks at Microsoft that are looking at potentially using nuclear power plants for their data centers. And we had an excellent discussion, and some alluded to how big that market is going to get in the near future here. And we asked him one simple question: what is your projection? And he basically said, if you add AI to what we project is already a growing market, we expect that we'll need the equivalent of what TVA produces today combined. So that's nuclear and non-nuclear. That's 30 gigawatts worldwide for one company. Multiply that by the 3 or 4 other companies, big ones that are looking at that. And he fully admitted that a very small fraction of that will be nuclear, so it will not be all nuclear, but they're looking at ways to decarbonize that entire sector. And a third example I'll share, since we talked about the value that nuclear energy brings with both high-quality steam and electricity generation at the same time. We've been approached by a European steel manufacturer that is also under pressure to decarbonize, and they basically said, you've done studies in the past that looked at the value proposition of deploying that particular technology. Help us with an independent study there.
So I think one thing that we're missing here is you have to understand for the industrial, what is the impact of not having reliable power. And for many of them, you're talking about trashing weeks of product. And they can't take that. At data centers, you have to dig into what is the reliability that they need. That's how they've ended up at our doorstep, right? I mean, so when you're, it's that, what is the reliability factor that they're after, and how consistent does that need to be? Data centers also need to have clean power, right? So they need conditioned electricity as well. They can't afford to have a lot of frequency variation. So if you want to get involved in an industrial discussion, it's not vastly, start with, why do you need this? What are the characteristics, right? What is the impact of not having the input that you need?
And Christine, since you're on the front end of a lot of this, again, what other industrial areas? I mean, you listed a whole bunch, but I mean, what do you think are some of the ones that we're going to see in the near future? What are the low-hanging fruit, I guess, out of it? We already heard, where X Energy is with Dow, but what are some of the other ones you think that we'll see sooner rather than later?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of folks don't understand the amount of ammonia that we use in our food supply, right? I mean, so energy is pervasive in almost everything that we do as a society. And so if looking at how ammonia is produced today, and that provides the fertilizer we need to grow the food that we want to eat, right? That's the holistic, systematic approach, and it's really hard to get your arms around that. Aviation fuels, right? I mean, we can electrify cars. That's actually relatively easy, not cheap, but easy. How large shipping over water, planes, those types of things. That's where synthetic fuels are going to be part of our future. How are we producing those fuels in a clean manner? Most all of these things are energy-intensive businesses. Cement and steel are very energy-intensive businesses. You have some steel manufacturers like Nucor who are saying, we're going to be all electric. But there's other manufacturing companies like forging companies, their heat comes from natural gas because they need it, and I'm really interested to see how hot Ben's going to have his reactor going here in 45 minutes, but how hot can you get it? Can you get it hot enough for your advanced manufacturing? Advanced manufacturing is going to go over multiple industries, so from a community perspective, that's a great way to diversify.
I'm going to open it up to...
Laura, go ahead and jump in.
I want to jump in
go ahead.
just to add to what Christine said, because I think one of the resources that I wanted to mention in this conversation that I think is useful, because I think for community leaders who are trying to figure out if this is the right co-location program for your community, knowing what your energy mix is and who those large commercial users are in your community is indicative of some of this list that Christine just made. But there's also, on the World Nuclear Association's website, they have a great list of heat values for various fuels. And it really starts to, I think, hone in on the technology advantages of different types of fuels and where nuclear could have a role. As you'll hear in the next session, different technologies can have different heat outputs, and so then there's this replacement value. And there's a lot of literature, it's kind of controversial around this whole idea of energy returned on energy invested. And I think that that's part of the equation that we're trying to figure out now as communities, and recognizing that discussion is, I think, a good place for community leaders to find a seat at the table and come in with some really good questions for vendors.
Yeah, all excellent points. I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions, but while you're thinking about those, Ben, working with the NRC, it seems to me that this is novel because we don't have nuclear co-located with industrial facilities as it stands now. How has that experience been? Any insight?
Yeah, I think you may be surprised to hear this, but when we first went hand in hand with Dow as partners to go talk to the NRC, there was really just excitement in the room across the board from the staff and the leadership, as well as the commission. Fundamentally, there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to do this. What you care about from the NRC perspective certainly is the hazard to the environment of the facility, and so you have to take into account the hazards from the environment as threats to the facility. When we first started working with industrials, I had to remind them, well, usually they didn't know this, but they were worried about, hey, what if our chemical plant blows up? What's the threat to your nuclear reactor? And the simple version of an answer to that is, well, we have to design to take a 747 direct impact fully loaded with jet fuel. Your hazard is nowhere near as bad as that. I mean, that's what the NRC makes us design to as a standard. So, once you get over that hurdle, right, then things become a little easier. Now, all that said, you do have to think about, what are the knock-on effects? How do you handle the in some kind of major accident scenario? How do you handle how the facilities interact with one another, the safety protocols, et cetera? And so, one of the best things about having a Gen 4 reactor like this is the safety case is so robust that you're not really reliant on human intervention or action to be able to ensure that the reactor ends up in a safe state. So you begin there, and then you can work with the NRC on making sure that we have designed what we plan to design, right, which is a reactor where the nuclear island is where the safety relevant portions of the reactor are, and what we call the conventional island, the stuff that generates power or how you transmit heat on the back end, is non-safety relevant. And so the NRC's jurisdiction really is on safety relevance. And so we're working with the NRC through this process. No red flags to date. I think they've been really excited to tackle this to some degree. And because of the great work from the Department of Energy laboratories and DOE as a funder for many years, the NRC has been grappling with many of these questions in advance of receiving this application from us. And so we've been in early engagement. We paid them to review, 20 topical reports and white papers, had extensive engagement with the NRC. But we're building this off of a very long history of DOE programs working directly with the NRC to build out the safety case associated with these reactors.
And Laura, a little bit beforehand, you were talking about, the companies are really focused on carbon-free energy production. But when you're a utility or you're a company and you need a large plant or you need a certain amount of megawatts, you're going to go across and you're going to say, okay, what are all the carbon-free? One of them is gas with carbon capture, as you're kind of going through. So what do you hear, like when you're talking to folks about nuclear and they're looking at the different options? How do they kind of look at that, and where do you think nuclear is starting to come out nowadays as versus before?
I think people see a path forward that they didn't see prior. There are more incentives, certainly in the US and North America. There are more incentives to work collaboratively on deployment projects, and that's important. But you're right, there is a really important discussion between project developers and technology vendors and the communities that are going to host these facilities to really understand what the electricity market looks like, what consumers are able to afford, what long-term energy prices are going to look like. I mentioned 2015 being a real turning point for the nuclear conversation with the Paris Agreement. The other date that always jumps out at me as really, really important to this conversation is 1990, which was the height of the electricity market restructuring in the United States. And so when you think about what to be thinking about and discussing with technology developers and project developers. I think there's a lot that communities know about the history of their relationships with investor-owned utilities as well as public utilities in their communities. We were having this conversation at breakfast this morning with the Salt River Project in Arizona. And it's a really important interface that you all know best. And that really drives the price of electricity. And PwC has a good white paper on this on their website that looks at how rapidly the electricity market is changing and how new types of players are coming into force. And so whether it's a build, own, operate model, or if a company plans to be an independent power producer and just sell their electricity or their heat or their steam into the marketplace, makes a big difference as to what this looks like. And that influences how buyers consider the different options they have. And so being ready to have that conversation, I think, is important.
Great, thank you. Yep. Christine.
Yeah, so I think there's also a part of, and I want to point out a couple activities that are going on. I think there's also the opportunity to attract a developer to a community because you have the industrial customer already, and you know that you're going to need that nuclear energy. And we're here because we need to do public engagement on this technology. This is a 100-year relationship you're about to get into. So I'll point out in Kentucky, you've recently said they've established a pathway by which communities can establish themselves as nuclear ready, right? And so I think that's an interesting way to come about this, is to say that we're nuclear ready. In West Virginia, West Virginia University is working on Zillow for the lower 22 counties. Okay, so let me explain that. So what are the things you input when you're in Zillow? You go, I want a 3-bedroom house, 2-bath, swimming pool, no swimming pool, right? Multi-family, single unit, all those types of things. So you think about those types of parameters. They're building that for their state. They have a solar layer that comes in there, so it goes ahead and screens to say, this is where solar projects go, this is where wind projects go. We're helping them build the nuclear projects. What I'm hoping is that they'll build an industrial layer on that. So I think there's all sorts of ways that we can, if you believe nuclear is going to be successful this time. Sorry, I had to say it. I've been in this business too long. I think there's ways that as a community and as a state, you can say, not only am I ready, but I have people interested in buying your product.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I think that's a great way to wrap up this particular panel, so please join me in thanking this panel. I'm going to hand it over to Kara now for the next panel.
Thank you all so much. Well, after it's on now. So if everybody from the Meet the Players session would come up and grab a seat here at the podium.